In 1994, a shepherd in Turkey noticed something strange sticking out of the ground. What archaeologists uncovered beneath that dusty hilltop didn't just rewrite history, it shattered it. The structure buried there was thousands of years older than it was supposed to be. Built by people who, according to every history book ever written, shouldn't have been capable of building anything at all. And here's the part nobody talks about. It was deliberately buried, hidden, by the same people who built it. The question isn't just who built it. The question is what they were hiding from. And that single site in Turkey is only number 10 on this list. His name was Klaus Schmidt. In 1994, he stood on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, staring at something that made no sense. Massive stone pillars, arranged in circles, carved with animals, foxes, scorpions, vultures. Each pillar weighing up to 20 tons. He had them dated. The results came back and Schmidt went quiet. 9600 BCE. 11,600 years old. That number didn't just challenge the accepted timeline of human civilization. It demolished it. Because according to everything archaeologists believed at that point, the people who lived in 9600 BCE were not supposed to be capable of this. They were hunter-gatherers, nomads, people who followed animal herds across dusty plains and slept wherever the night found them. They were not supposed to be building temples. For over a century, historians taught the same story. Humans discovered farming. Farming created food surplus. Surplus allowed permanent settlements. Settlements eventually grew large enough to build monumental structures. In that order. Always in that order. Göbekli Tepe doesn't just challenge that order. It reverses it completely. The people who built this site had no farms, no domesticated crops, no permanent villages, no pottery, no writing, no wheel. Yet they quarried, transported, and precisely positioned stones that modern construction equipment would struggle to move today. Moving the largest pillars alone would have required hundreds of workers, coordinated, fed, organized, directed by someone with authority over large groups of people. That kind of social organization wasn't supposed to exist yet. So where did it come from? The carvings on the pillars suggest something even more unsettling. The artistry is consistent across the entire site. The same techniques, the same symbols, the same level of precision repeated across dozens of stone surfaces. That consistency doesn't happen by accident. It requires training. It requires specialists who dedicated their lives to a craft. It requires a tradition of knowledge passed deliberately from one generation to the next. Someone taught them. But here is where Göbekli Tepe stops being merely mysterious and becomes something else entirely. Around 8000 BCE, roughly 600 years after construction began, the entire complex was buried, not abandoned, not destroyed by war or earthquake or flood, buried, deliberately, carefully, completely. The builders filled every enclosure with tons of soil, rubble, and animal bones, entombing their own creation beneath the earth with a precision that mirrored the precision they had used to build it. No evidence of warfare preceded the burial, no catastrophic climate event, no sign of disease or disaster. They simply decided to erase it. And whatever drove that decision, they took the reason with them into silence. Schmidt excavated Göbekli Tepe until his death in 2014. He believed only around 5% of the site had been uncovered. Geophysical surveys suggest at least 16 additional circular enclosures remain buried, beneath that hilltop, untouched, waiting. Which means the structure we know, the one that already shattered a century of archaeological consensus, is only a fragment of something far larger. And if a civilization capable of all this left almost no other trace of itself across the landscape, the question that follows is one archaeology has never been able to answer. How many others were there? How many hilltops across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran conceal something similar? How many were never buried and simply eroded into dust across 11,000 years of wind and rain? The builders of Göbekli Tepe didn't come from nowhere. Someone taught them. Someone came before them. And we have no idea who. In 1977, a Canadian archaeologist named Jacques Cinquemar crawled into 3 small limestone caves in the remote Yukon Territory. Nobody was watching. Nobody considered it important enough to watch. The caves were small, unremarkable. 54 kilometers southwest of a village called Old Crow, buried in one of the most isolated landscapes in North America. What he pulled from the soil inside those caves would consume the next 20 years of his life. And the scientific community would spend those same 20 years trying to destroy him for it. The bones weren't unusual at first glance. Horse, mammoth, caribou, bison, Ice Age megafauna, expected in a site like this. But the bones carried marks. Thin, precise cuts running across the surfaces in patterns that Cinq-Mars identified immediately. Stone tools had made those marks. Human hands had held those tools. He sent the bones for radiocarbon dating and waited. The results came back at approximately 24,000 years old. 24,000 years. At the time, the accepted model of North American prehistory held that humans first crossed into the Americas roughly 13,000 to 15,000 years ago. The Clovis people. Distinctive stone points scattered across the continent. A clean, accepted, unquestioned timeline. Cinq-Mars had just pushed that timeline back by 10,000 years. And the archaeological establishment did not thank him for it. What followed was not a scientific debate. It was a systematic dismantling of a man's career. His findings were dismissed. His samples declared contaminated. His identification of the cut marks called into question by researchers who had never visited the site. His funding dried up. His work was treated not as a controversial discovery requiring further investigation, but as an embarrassment requiring suppression. For over 20 years, the Bluefish Caves sat in professional limbo. Too important to ignore completely. Too inconvenient to accept. And Cinq-Mars kept returning to those caves, knowing what he had found, watching the years pass while the establishment looked the other way. Then, in 2017, everything changed. A team led by Lauriane Bourgeon at the University of Montreal reanalyzed the bluefish bones using technology that didn't exist when Cinq-Mars made his original discovery. High magnification microscopy. Detailed comparison against known patterns of butchery marks, carnivore damage, and natural weathering. Their findings, published in the journal PLOS ONE, were unambiguous. The marks were made by human tools. The oldest dated bone came in at approximately 24,000 years before present. Cinq-Mars had been right all along. But here is what that confirmation actually means. Because it goes far beyond one man's vindication. 24,000 years ago, the world was locked in the coldest period of the last ice age. Massive ice sheets covered most of Canada. Temperatures dropped to lethal extremes. The landscape offered almost nothing in the way of shelter or reliable food. Yet someone was inside those caves, butchering horses, processing mammoth. Surviving conditions that should have been impossible for small bands of humans without sophisticated tools, complex clothing systems, and regional knowledge accumulated across generations. They weren't passing through. The evidence suggests repeated occupation, the same caves, again and again, across thousands of years, which means these people weren't lost travelers stumbling through a frozen wilderness. They knew exactly where they were. They had been there before. They would come back. And that raises the question that no one has been able to answer. If humans were living in the Yukon 24,000 years ago, where did they come from before that? They didn't materialize in those caves fully adapted to Ice Age survival. That kind of knowledge takes generations to build. Centuries of trial and error. Accumulated wisdom about which plants don't kill you, which roots stay passable in winter, which caves stay warm enough to survive the night. Someone taught them, which means there was a population before them. A population living somewhere across the vast frozen expanse of Beringia, across Alaska, across regions now buried under hundreds of feet of ocean as sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. An entire chapter of human prehistory, lived out across landscapes that no longer exist, remembered by no one. The Bluefish Caves aren't the beginning of the story. They're a single fragment pulled from the middle of something we have almost entirely lost. And the only reason we have even that fragment is because 3 small limestone caves in the Yukon happen to preserve what the rest of the landscape swallowed. Jacques Cinq-Mars died in 2004. 13 years before the scientific community confirmed what he had spent his career trying to tell them. He never heard the vindication. But the bones he found are still speaking. And what they're saying gets darker the longer you listen. Because if the accepted timeline of human migration into the Americas was wrong by 10,000 years, what else is wrong? What other discoveries are sitting in boxes in university storage rooms right now, labeled as contaminated, dismissed as impossible, waiting for technology that doesn't exist yet to prove them right? How many Jacques 5 Mars are out there? How many already gave up? 20,000 years ago, the map of the world looked nothing like it does today. Not slightly different, nothing like it. Where the South China Sea sits now, there was land. Where the Java Sea rolls between islands, there were rivers. Where the Gulf of Thailand stretches for hundreds of kilometers of open water, there were forests, plains, and valleys fed by some of the largest river systems on Earth. Geologists call it Sundaland, and some researchers now believe it was the birthplace of human civilization. Not the Fertile Crescent, not Mesopotamia. A landmass twice the size of India that the ocean swallowed so completely that we spent all of recorded history not knowing it existed. The numbers are difficult to absorb. At the peak of the last ice age, global sea levels sat approximately 120 meters lower than they do today. That single fact reshapes every coastline on the planet. But nowhere more dramatically than Southeast Asia. The exposed portion of the Sunda Shelf created a landmass of extraordinary fertility. Tropical climate, abundant rainfall, river systems draining from the highlands of modern Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, spreading across vast lowland plains before emptying into seas that sat far beyond their current shorelines. Every ingredient required for complex human society was present there in abundance. Fertile soil, fresh water, stable climate, protein-rich coastlines and rivers. More abundant, arguably, than anything the Fertile Crescent ever offered. And unlike the Fertile Crescent, which has remained above sea level throughout all of human history, Sundaland is gone. Completely. Permanently. Gone. The drowning began slowly. Around 14,000 BCE, as the ice sheets began their long collapse, meltwater started pouring into the world's oceans. Sea levels rose gradually at first. The lowest coastal plains flooded. Shorelines retreated inland. What had been dry ground became tidal marsh, then shallow sea. But then the process accelerated. In pulses, rapid, devastating pulses driven by the sudden collapse of massive ice sheets in the northern hemisphere. During the most extreme phases, sea levels rose at rates of several meters per century. Think about what that means for a population living on a coastal plain. Villages abandoned in childhood would be miles beneath the sea by the time those same children grew old. Fishing grounds that grandparents had worked would become open ocean within a single lifetime. The landscape itself was being consumed, generation by generation, with no way to stop it and nowhere left to go but inland. And inland meant mountains. And mountains meant less food, less water, less of everything that had sustained whatever civilization had grown on those drowned plains below. In 1998, geneticist Stephen Oppenheimer published research arguing that the mythologies, languages, and genetic signatures of populations scattered across Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and parts of the Middle East preserved echoes of exactly this event. A drowned homeland, a great flood. His analysis of mitochondrial DNA suggested that populations spread outward from Sundaland in waves beginning roughly 14,000 years ago, precisely when the rising seas would have begun consuming the lowland plains. The timing matched, the genetics matched, and the flood myths matched. Cultures stretching from the Philippines to Mesopotamia, from the islands of the Pacific to the river valleys of India, all carry versions of the same story. A great civilization, a rising sea, a desperate migration away from a world being swallowed by water. For a long time, those stories were treated as mythology, metaphor. The kind of thing ancient people invented to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. But what if they weren't metaphor? What if they were memory? Marine archaeology has begun finding things on the seafloor beneath the South China Sea and the Java Sea that don't fit neatly into any geological explanation. Sonar surveys have identified submerged river channels running across the seabed in pattern consistent with the drainage, systems that would have crossed Sundaland's lowland plains. Terraced landforms on underwater ridges, features that some researchers interpret as evidence of modification by human hands. Stone tools have been dredged from the seafloor, ancient wood and charcoal recovered from depths that place them firmly within the drowned landscape of the Ice Age. None of this is proof, but all of it is consistent with what we would expect to find if a civilization had existed there and been consumed by the rising ocean. Here is what makes Sundaland different from every other lost civilization on this list. The others vanished through abandonment, conquest, or collapse. Sundaland didn't collapse, it drowned, slowly, across 4,000 years of incremental loss, each generation inheriting a smaller world than the one before it. Each community watching the sea consume another valley, another river delta, another stretch of coastline that had fed their grandparents. Whatever infrastructure they had built, whatever knowledge they had accumulated, whatever monuments or cities or ceremonial sites had grown on those fertile plains, all of it went beneath the water, not in a single catastrophic moment that might have been remembered with clarity, but gradually enough that the memory dissolved along with the land itself. By the time the flooding was complete, around 7000 BCE, Sundaland had lost roughly 3 million square kilometers of territory. 3 million square kilometers of what may have been the most fertile, most hospitable, most densely populated landscape on Earth during the Ice Age, gone beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, and the people who survived, scattered across the highlands of Southeast Asia and the islands that remained above water, no longer had the resources, the population density, or the social organization to maintain whatever complexity their ancestors had achieved on the drowned plains below. They started over, from almost nothing, carrying only what could survive in human memory across generations of displacement and loss, which may explain why the flood myths survived when everything else was forgotten. You can drown a city. You can drown a monument. You can drown an entire civilization. But the memory of watching your world disappear beneath the water? That gets passed down, generation after generation, until it becomes myth, until it becomes religion, until the people carrying it no longer remember that it was ever real. The seafloor beneath the South China Sea is one of the least explored environments on Earth. Less than 20% of the world's ocean floors have been mapped with the resolution required to identify human-scale features. Which means whatever Sundaland left behind, if anything survived the drowning and the millennia of sedimentation that followed, is almost certainly still down there, waiting, in the dark, in the silence, in water so deep that the people who built it never imagined anything could follow them there. In 1877, an American zoologist named Edward Morse stepped off a train at Omori Station just outside Tokyo. He wasn't looking for history. He was collecting shells. But as the train had passed through the embankment, he'd noticed something eroding from the exposed soil. Fragments, pottery, ancient shell deposits layered into the earth in patterns that suggested deliberate accumulation over long periods of time. He returned to excavate. What emerged from that embankment would reveal one of the most confounding civilizations in human prehistory, the Jōmon. And the truly disturbing part isn't how long they lasted. It's what they managed to do without any of the things we consider necessary for civilization to exist at all. The Jōmon culture inhabited the Japanese archipelago from approximately 14,000 BCE until roughly 300 BCE. Read that number again. 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE. That's over 13,000 years of continuous cultural tradition, longer than all of recorded history, multiple times over. And they did it without agriculture. They were hunter-gatherers. No domesticated crops for the vast majority of their existence. No large animals. No cities in the conventional sense. By every standard criterion archaeologists use to define a civilization, the Jōmon shouldn't qualify. Yet they produced the oldest pottery ever discovered anywhere on Earth. Fragments of Jōmon pottery recovered from the Odai Yamamoto site in northern Japan have been dated to approximately 14,500 BCE, That's 16,500 years ago. They were making sophisticated ceramic vessels thousands of years before pottery appeared in the Middle East. Thousands of years before anyone in the Fertile Crescent figured out how to fire clay into something permanent. The word Jōmon means cord-marked, a reference to the distinctive patterns they pressed into wet clay using twisted plant fibers. They were creating art before agriculture had been invented anywhere in the world, which shouldn't be possible, because pottery requires sedentary life. You don't carry fragile ceramic vessels across seasonal migrations. You make pottery when you stay in one place long enough for breakable things to be worth the effort of creating. The Jōmon were sedentary hunter-gatherers, a combination that isn't supposed to exist. Their settlements tell the same impossible story. Sites like Sanai Maruyama in northern Japan housed hundreds of people in organized communities with pit houses, storage facilities, and evidence of long-distance trade networks stretching across the archipelago. They built ceremonial structures. They produced specialized craft goods. They maintained population densities that required careful resource management and social coordination. They lived like agriculturalists, without agriculture, for 13,000 years. Most agricultural civilizations haven't lasted a tenth of that. And then there are the dogu, small ceramic figurines, produced by the thousands across the later phases of Jōmon culture. Humanoid shapes, but wrong. Features that don't quite make sense. Some have enormous goggle-like eyes that dominate their faces. Others wear elaborate headdresses. Patterned bodies covered in designs that suggest ritual significance no one has ever been able to decode. The Jōmon made them, deliberately, carefully, across generations. And then they broke, not accidentally, deliberately. Archaeologists have found dogu smashed into pieces before burial, as if the act of destroying them was as important as the act of creating them in the first place. Thousands of these figurines have been recovered from Jōmon sites. We have no idea what they meant, no idea what they represented, no idea why breaking them mattered. The Jōmon invested enormous effort in producing objects whose purpose died with them. What makes the Jōmon genuinely unsettling isn't any single artifact. It's the stability. 13,000 years. Most cultures that survive for even a few centuries do so through constant adaptation. Migration, conquest, being conquered. The rise and fall of dynasties and kingdoms and empires that measure their lifespans in generations, not millennia. The Jōmon didn't do any of that. They stayed in place, developed regional traditions, maintained cultural continuity across a timespan that has no parallel anywhere in the archaeological record. They figured out something we haven't: how to live in balance with an environment across geological timescales. How to sustain a complex society without depleting the resources that society depends on. How to exist for longer than empires, longer than languages, longer than entire epochs of human history. And they did it so successfully that they had no need to change, until they did. Around 300 BCE, the Jōmon culture gave way to the Yayoi culture, new populations arriving from the Asian mainland, bringing rice agriculture, bringing new technologies, bringing change the Jōmon had avoided for 13,000 years. The transition wasn't violent, it was gradual. A slow blending of populations. The Jōmon didn't vanish, they were absorbed, integrated. Their descendants are still there, carrying Jōmon DNA in percentages that vary across the Japanese islands. But whatever they understood about how to sustain a society for 13,000 years, without agriculture, without writing, without cities, without any of the infrastructure we consider essential, that knowledge didn't survive the transition. It dissolved into rice paddies and new languages and new gods. We live in agricultural civilizations that have existed for roughly 10,000 years, and we spend significant portions of our intellectual energy wondering if ours will survive the next century. The Jōmon lasted 13,000 years. They knew something we don't, and they took it with them into the clay figurines with empty eyes that will never tell us what they saw, scattered across the western coastlines of Europe. From southern Spain through Portugal, France, Ireland, Britain, and into Scandinavia stand tens of thousands of massive stone tombs. They don't look natural. They look deliberate, constructed from slabs weighing tens of tons each, balanced in configurations that have survived storms, earthquakes, and 5,000 years of weather without collapsing. Archaeologists call them dolmens, from a Breton word meaning stone table, and for over a century, no one could explain how they got there, or why they appeared across 5,000 kilometers of coastline in the span of just a few centuries, or who built them, or where those builders went when they stopped. The scale of individual dolmens makes the mystery worse. The capstone of the Brownshill dolmen in County Carlow, Ireland, weighs approximately 150 tons. 150 tons. That's heavier than a fully loaded Boeing 737. The people who moved that stone had no wheels, no draft animals capable of pulling that kind of weight, no metal tools, no cranes, no machinery of any kind. Just stone, wood, rope, and whatever collective labor they could organize. The mathematics of moving a 150-ton block using only human muscle are brutal. You need hundreds of workers, operating in sustained coordination, for weeks, possibly months. You need to feed them, house them, organize them under some form of authority capable of directing that many people toward a single task. That requires social complexity. It requires planning. It requires a reason compelling enough to justify the investment of that much labor into something that serves no obvious survival function. Because these weren't homes, they were tombs, monuments to the dead. Which means the builders valued their dead enough to move mountains for them. The distribution of the dolmens is what turns the mystery into something genuinely unsettling. They appear suddenly in the archaeological record around 4800 BCE, not in one location, everywhere, across the entire Atlantic coastline of Europe, from Iberia to Scandinavia. Tens of thousands of monuments following remarkably similar construction principles, despite being built by populations separated by thousands of kilometers. For decades, archaeologists assumed the tradition had spread slowly over land, passed from community to community across generations as people migrated and mingled. Then, in 2019, a team led by Bettina Schultz-Poulsen at the University of Gothenburg published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that shattered that assumption completely. Poulsen's team used Bayesian statistical modeling on radiocarbon dates from over 400 megalithic sites across Europe. The analysis revealed something no one had expected. The tradition likely originated in northwestern France around 4700 BCE, and then spread outward along the Atlantic coast within just a few centuries. Not slowly, faster than any purely terrestrial diffusion could account for. The only explanation that fits the timeline is one that rewrites what we thought we knew about Neolithic Europe. The builders were traveling by sea. Seafaring wasn't supposed to be sophisticated in 4500 BCE. The prevailing model held that European coastal populations at that time were capable of only limited coastal navigation. Short hops between visible shorelines, nothing ambitious. Nothing that would allow the rapid transmission of complex cultural and religious traditions across thousands of kilometers of open water. The dolmen distribution suggests the opposite. By 4500 BCE, someone along the Atlantic coast had developed maritime technology advanced enough to carry not just people, but entire belief systems across vast stretches of ocean. They navigated the Bay of Biscay, crossed the English Channel, traveled the Irish Sea, possibly reached Scandinavia by hopping along coastlines in vessels we have no physical evidence of, because wood doesn't survive. Not across 7,000 years of saltwater and coastal erosion. The boats are gone. The navigators are gone. All that remains are the stones they left behind in places they could only have reached by sea. The alignments make it worse. Many dolmens are oriented with precision toward solstices, lunar standstills, or other celestial events that only become apparent when you track the sky across decades. The builders weren't just moving stones. They were encoding astronomical knowledge into monuments meant to endure beyond memory. They were leaving messages for someone, possibly for themselves, possibly for descendants who never arrived, possibly for the dead whose remains they entombed in chambers designed to outlast empires. And the messages worked. The stones are still standing, we can still measure their alignments. We can calculate exactly what they were pointing at in the night sky 5,000 years ago. But the meaning of what they were trying to say has dissolved entirely. Because somewhere around 3000 BCE, the tradition faded. The dolmen builders stopped building, not everywhere at once, but gradually, community by community, region by region. No evidence of conquest, no signs of catastrophic collapse, no mass graves or burned settlements suggesting violent end. They simply stopped. And whatever drove them to invest generations of labor into moving 150-ton stones, whatever they believed about death and the dead and the sky and the sea, whatever connected communities separated by thousands of kilometers into a shared tradition of monumental construction, all of it vanished into the Atlantic wind. We have their tombs. We have their bones inside the tombs. We have fragments of pottery and stone tools scattered across the burial sites. What we don't have is any coherent understanding of who they believed themselves to be, what language they spoke, what gods they worshipped, or what they were so desperately trying to preserve by carving it into stone and aligning it with the stars. The dolmens are still there, still aligned, still standing, still speaking in a language we can measure but cannot understand. And the people who built them remain as silent now as the stones they left behind. In 1908, a Serbian archaeologist named Milova Vasic began excavating a low mound on the banks of the Danube River, 14 kilometers downstream from Belgrade. Nothing about the site suggested it would rewrite the history of European civilization. It was just a mound, until he started digging. What emerged from the soil across the following decades revealed a culture that flourished across the Central Balkans from approximately 5700 BCE to 4500 BCE, a span of over 1,000 years, the Vinča culture. And at their peak, they were doing things that weren't supposed to be possible yet. The settlements were massive. Some housed thousands of people in carefully planned communities with two-story houses, organized streets, and sophisticated craft industries. They produced copper tools at a scale that required organized mining operations, specialized knowledge of ore identification, and controlled high-temperature furnaces. Copper smelting at the site of Belovod in eastern Serbia has been dated to approximately 5000 BCE. That pushes the origin of European metallurgy back by roughly 500 years from the previously accepted timeline. 500 years, which means someone had been experimenting with copper long before Belovod. Someone whose workshops haven't been found yet, or may never be found. But here is where the Vinča culture becomes something else entirely. They left symbols, thousands of them, carved into pottery, scratched onto figurines, pressed into spindle whorls, inscribed on small clay tablets recovered from sites scattered across the Balkans. Over 400 distinct signs. Some are simple, lines and crosses, dots and circles. Others are complex combinations of geometric shapes and curves that repeat in patterns across different objects and different sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. The consistency is what makes them disturbing. Because consistency suggests meaning. It suggests the symbols were readable to the people who made them. The question that has divided archaeologists for decades is simple. Were they writing? The earliest confirmed writing system is Sumerian cuneiform. It emerged around 3200 BCE in Mesopotamia. The Vinča symbols predate cuneiform by roughly 2,000 years. 2,000 years. If the Vinča signs represent actual writing, they are the oldest known writing system in human history. And their existence would mean that literacy, or something close to it, emerged in the Balkans before it emerged in the Fertile Crescent. That possibility has generated fierce debate. Some researchers, including Harald Harman and archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, argued that the Vinča signs represent a proto-writing system with consistent syntactic patterns. Others dismiss them as purely symbolic markings, decorative, religious perhaps, but not linguistic. The debate has no resolution, because there is no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription, no later script derived from the Vinča marks that would allow anyone to decode what they meant. The symbols appear on thousands of objects. They follow patterns. They repeat with enough consistency to suggest they conveyed specific information. But The code, if there ever was one, died with the people who created it, and those people vanished completely. Around 4500 BCE, the Vinca culture collapsed. The large settlements were abandoned. The copper workshops fell silent. The symbol tradition disappeared. No one knows why. Climate shifts have been proposed. Invasions by pastoralist populations from the steppes. Internal social breakdown. But no single explanation has universal acceptance. What is certain is that the end was comprehensive. A civilization that had sustained itself for over 1,000 years. That had pioneered metallurgy in Europe. That may have been on the verge of developing true writing, simply ceased to exist. The people either assimilated into incoming populations or died out entirely, and the knowledge they had accumulated across 40 generations dissolved into the soil of the Danube Valley. Think about what that means. If the Vinca had survived another 1,000 years, European history might look completely different. Writing might have emerged from the Balkans instead of Mesopotamia. The alphabet you're reading right now might trace its ancestry not to Phoenician traders, but to Neolithic farmers carving symbols into clay along the Danube. The entire trajectory of Western civilization might have followed a different course. Instead, they vanished, and we are left with thousands of inscribed artifacts whose meanings will almost certainly never be recovered. The symbols are still there, preserved in museums across Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, carefully catalogued, photographed, studied by linguists and cryptographers and computer scientists, using algorithms designed to detect patterns in unknown languages. And the symbols remain silent. 400 distinct signs, thousands of inscriptions, patterns consistent enough to suggest deliberate communication, but no voice behind them, no sound, just marks in clay that once meant something to someone and now mean nothing to anyone. The Vinca left us their houses, their pottery, their copper tools, their bones, and thousands upon thousands of symbols that look like writing, that feel like writing, that were almost certainly meaningful in some way we can no longer access. They were so close, close to something that might have changed everything. And then they were gone, taking whatever they were trying to say with them into the silence of 5,000 years. In September 1931, the crew of a fishing trawler called the Kalinda was dragging nets across the floor of the North Sea. 40 kilometers off the coast of Norfolk, England, routine work, unremarkable until the nets came up. Tangled in the mesh was a lump of peat, dark, waterlogged, the kind of compressed organic material that forms on land, not underwater. And embedded in that peat was something that made no sense. A barbed antler point, a tool for hunting fish or small game, roughly 12,000 years old. It hadn't been dropped into the sea by someone fishing from a boat. It had been left on dry land, in a landscape where people hunted, camped, and lived before the entire world they knew was swallowed by water. Where the North Sea rolls now, there was once a country, a real country, with rivers and forests and hills, animals, people. Lives lived across generations on ground that felt as permanent to them as any continent feels to us. Geologists call it Doggerland. And at its maximum extent, it covered approximately 46,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of the modern Netherlands combined with a significant portion of England. Not a small island, a landmass. At the peak of the last ice age, Doggerland was a vast plain connecting Britain to continental Europe. The Thames and the Rhine flowed together across this landscape before emptying into a sea that lay far to the north of their modern outlets. Herds of mammoth, reindeer, horse, and wild cattle grazed across grasslands that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. And following those herds, living among the wetlands and riverbanks, were bands of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. They had tools, shelters, social structures, knowledge of the land refined across hundreds of generations. They knew where the herds migrated, which plants were safe, which routes stayed passable in winter. They weren't wandering aimlessly. They were home. And archaeologists estimate that tens of thousands of people may have lived there across the millennia, possibly more during favorable climate periods. Then the ice sheets began to melt, slowly at first. The sea level rose gradually. The lowest coastal regions submerged. The outer plains turned into tidal marshland. Rivers that had flowed for thousands of years found new routes as the land beneath them shifted and sank. But the people adapted. They moved inland, found higher ground, adjusted their routes and hunting territories to match the changing coastline. For a while it worked. For a while then, around 6200 BCE, something catastrophic happened. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway. Geologists call it the Storegga Slide. A section of the continental shelf, roughly the size of Iceland, collapsed into the deep ocean, displacing an unimaginable volume of water in seconds. The tsunami that followed raced across the North Sea basin at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. When the waves struck the remaining high ground of Doggerland, they reached heights of over 5 meters. Anyone caught in the open would have had no warning, no time to run, no high ground close enough to reach. The waves inundated settlements, contaminated freshwater supplies with salt, killed anyone who couldn't outrun water moving faster than any human can sprint. And in the aftermath, what little habitable land remained was no longer enough to support the populations that had called Doggerland home. The survivors fled, some to what would become the British Isles, some to the European mainland, carrying nothing but what they could hold, leaving behind everything they couldn't. Within a few centuries of the Storegga tsunami, the last refuges of Doggerland slipped beneath the waves. And within a few generations after that, the memory of it faded. The refugees' children knew the stories. Their grandchildren remembered fragments. Their great-grandchildren heard only legends about a land that had been lost to the sea. And then, eventually, even the legends stopped. An entire country, tens of thousands of people, lives, stories, languages, gods, all dissolved into the oral traditions of surrounding regions until nothing coherent remained. For over 8,000 years, nobody remembered that Doggerland had ever existed. The only reason we know about it now is because fishing trawlers occasionally pull things from the mud. Antler points, mammoth bones, stone tools, fragments of a drowned world that surface by accident in fishing nets, reminding us that what lies beneath the North Sea is not just water. It's a country, with borders that shifted as the sea consumed them, with people who lived and died never knowing their world was temporary, with children who played in valleys that are now 200 feet underwater. The North Sea is one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. Thousands of vessels cross it every year. None of them know they're sailing over the remains of a civilization that lasted longer than most empires. None of them know that beneath the hull, in the silt and sand, are the hunting grounds and campsites and graves of people whose names we will never recover. Doggerland is still down there, still real, still holding the bones of tens of thousands of people who will never be remembered. And the only voice it has left is the occasional artifact that surfaces in a fishing net, silent and incomprehensible, speaking a language of absence that no one is left to translate. In 1921, Indian archaeologist Rakhaldas Banerjee began excavating a mound in the Larkana district of what is now Pakistan. The locals called it Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead. Nobody knew why it had that name. Nobody remembered what was buried there. Banerjee dug anyway. What he uncovered beneath that mound, along with parallel discoveries being made at Harappa 600 kilometers to the northeast, revealed one of the largest civilizations of the ancient world. A civilization that had been completely forgotten for over 3,000 years. And here's the part that makes it genuinely disturbing. We still can't understand a single word they wrote. The Indus Valley civilization flourished from approximately 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE across an area spanning modern Pakistan, northwestern India, and parts of Afghanistan. At its peak, it covered roughly 1.25 million square kilometers, larger than contemporary Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. The cities were unlike anything else in the ancient world. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were built on precise grid plans with urban organization that wouldn't be matched anywhere for millennia. Streets ran at right angles. Buildings were constructed from standardized fired bricks whose dimensions remained consistent across hundreds of kilometers of territory. Every significant house had access to a sophisticated water supply and drainage system, private wells, bathing platforms, toilets connected to covered sewers that drained into municipal networks running beneath the streets. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a waterproofed rectangular pool surrounded by colonnades and changing rooms, represents the oldest known public water facility on Earth. The Indus cities had sanitation infrastructure superior to what existed in most European cities as recently as the 19th century. Think about that. 4,000 years ago, people in the Indus Valley had better plumbing than Victorian London. They engaged in long-distance trade with Mesopotamia, exporting carnelian beads, copper, timber, and possibly textiles across thousands of kilometers of sea and land. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamian cities. Mesopotamian goods have been found in Indus sites. The trade networks were extensive, organized, operating at a scale that required centralized administrative control. They produced standardized weights and measures across their entire territory, suggesting precision that most ancient civilizations never achieved. They manufactured sophisticated bronze objects, fine jewelry, and figurines of remarkable artistic quality. And they did all of this without leaving behind the kind of monumental royal imagery that dominates Egyptian and Mesopotamian archaeology. No clear depictions of kings, no warriors, no battles, no temples we can confidently identify as such. No tombs containing rulers buried with lavish grave goods. The Indus Valley civilization appears to have been organized along principles we cannot reconstruct, governed by institutions we cannot identify, populated by people whose beliefs we cannot access, because we cannot read what they wrote. The Harappans left behind thousands of inscribed objects, primarily small seals made of steatite, depicting animals alongside short inscriptions in an unknown script. Archaeologists have catalogued over 400 distinct signs across approximately 4,000 known inscriptions. The signs appear in consistent patterns. They were clearly meaningful. They were clearly writing. And after nearly a century of attempts by linguists, cryptographers, computer scientists, and codebreakers, no one has ever successfully decoded them. Not once. Not even close. The problem is fundamental. We have no bilingual inscriptions, no Rosetta Stone, no later script derived from the Indus system that might provide a starting point. We don't know what language the Harappans spoke. We don't know if the script represents a full writing system or a more limited notation for trade and administration. We can see the marks. We cannot hear the voices behind them. Researchers have tried everything. Statistical analysis comparing sign frequencies, computer algorithms designed to detect linguistic patterns, comparisons with every known ancient language from the region. Nothing has worked. The script remains completely, utterly, impossibly silent, which means we are looking at one of the largest urban civilizations in the ancient world, and we have no idea what they call themselves. No idea what gods they worshipped, if they worshipped gods at all. No idea what stories they told their children. No idea what laws governed them or what values held their society together for 2,000 years. We can measure their streets. We can analyze their drainage systems. We can trace their trade routes and catalog their artifacts. But we cannot hear them speak. And that silence is more disturbing than any mystery on this list. Because this isn't a small village lost to time. This is a civilization that rivaled Egypt in sophistication, that built at a scale matched only by the greatest powers of the ancient world, and they are as voiceless now as if they had never existed at all. Then, around 900 BCE, the civilization began to decline. Not suddenly, slowly. The cities were gradually abandoned. The trade networks collapsed. The script fell out of use. The standardized brick sizes and weights disappeared from the archaeological record. Various explanations have been proposed. Climate change shifting the monsoon patterns, the drying of river systems, tectonic disturbances, disease, the gradual movement of population southeastward toward the Ganges Valley, but no single cause has been proven. What is clear is that the end was not catastrophic. It was a slow dissolution over several centuries. A civilization that had lasted 2,000 years simply faded. Its people scattered. Its cities fell silent. Its language was lost. And for over 3,000 years, nobody remembered. The ruins sat beneath the soil of Pakistan and India, accumulating dust and silt and the weight of centuries, while empires rose and fell across the same landscape with no knowledge that something vast had come before them. Mohenjo-Daro was rediscovered by accident, a mound that locals avoided because it felt wrong, a place they called the Mound of the Dead without knowing why. We stumbled upon one of the largest civilizations in human history because someone decided to excavate a place that had a bad reputation. The seals are still there, preserved in museums, photographed, catalogued, analyzed by every method modern science can bring to bear. 400 distinct signs, 4,000 inscriptions, patterns that suggest grammar, syntax, deliberate communication, and absolute, impenetrable silence. The Indus Valley civilization built cities that housed hundreds of thousands. They traded across continents. They organized society at a scale that required writing, administration, and centralized control. And when they wrote down what mattered to them, what they believed, what they wanted future generations to know, they did so in a language that died so completely that we cannot recover a single word. They are speaking. We can see their mouths moving, but we will never hear what they were trying to say. In 1958, British archaeologist James Mellart was surveying the Konya Plain in south-central Turkey when his team encountered two large mounds rising from the flat agricultural landscape. Nothing about them suggested they would rewrite the earliest chapters of urban history. They were just hills. Until excavations began in 1961. What emerged from beneath those mounds was a massive Neolithic settlement occupied continuously from approximately 7500 BCE to 5700 BCE. At its peak, it housed between 5,000 and 8,000 people in a densely packed community covering roughly 13 hectares. It was one of the largest human settlements anywhere in the world during its existence. And it was built on principles that bear almost no resemblance to any city built before or since. Because Çatalhöyük had no streets, the houses were constructed directly against one another, sharing walls, forming a continuous honeycomb of mud brick structures with no paths or alleys running between them. None. The residents entered their homes through openings in the roofs, climbing ladders up from the dwellings below and down into their own interiors. The rooftops served as the primary circulation network, a vast interconnected landscape of clay terraces where people walked, worked, and socialized above the enclosed warren of rooms beneath. Waste was deposited in designated areas between clusters of houses. Food was prepared on hearths built into walls and floors. The dead were buried beneath the platforms where the living slept. 8,000 people, living directly on top of each other, with no streets. For nearly 2,000 years. The integration of the dead into domestic space is what makes Çatalhöyük genuinely disturbing. The residents didn't bury their dead in cemeteries outside the settlement. They buried them inside their own houses, beneath the sleeping platforms, beneath the floors, sometimes directly beneath the places where children played. In some cases, the skulls of deceased relatives were removed after burial, plastered with clay, painted with ochre to simulate flesh, and kept in the household as objects of ongoing reverence. These plastered skulls have been found across multiple houses, suggesting the practice was widespread rather than exceptional. The people of Çatalhöyük lived among their dead. Literally, the ancestors weren't elsewhere. They were beneath the floor, beneath the bed, beneath every meal and every conversation. Present and absent simultaneously across multiple generations. The wall paintings make it worse. Many houses were decorated with elaborate murals depicting bulls, leopards, vultures, and headless human figures. One famous painting appears to show a landscape of houses with a volcano erupting in the background. Possibly the nearby volcano Hasan Dağı, which was active during the site's occupation. If the interpretation is correct, it would be the oldest known landscape painting in human history. Other images show vultures descending upon headless corpses, a visual theme that some researchers connect to the practice of excarnation, where the dead were exposed to carrion birds before their cleaned bones were brought inside for burial beneath the house floors. The residents decorated their homes with images of death, predators, and celestial dangers. and they slept above the physical remains of their ancestors while surrounded by these paintings. Think about what that means for daily life. Every night, lying down to sleep directly above the bones of people you once knew. Every morning, waking up in a room painted with vultures and headless bodies. Every day, walking across rooftops that served as streets above a city of the dead. What makes Çatalhöyük truly mysterious is what's missing. There are no public buildings, no temples distinct from ordinary houses, no obvious signs of social hierarchy, no elite residences, no palaces, no tombs of rulers buried with special goods. Every house is roughly the same size and construction as every other house. Every family appears to have had roughly the same access to food, tools, and ritual objects. Thousands of people lived together in dense proximity for nearly 2,000 years without developing any of the institutions. Archaeologists consider prerequisites for urban life: no evidence of kingdoms, no priests, no administrative classes, no organized warfare, no evidence that any single family or lineage accumulated significantly more wealth than any other. Çatalhöyük worked. And it worked for 80 generations without any of the structures we consider necessary to make large communities function. The question that has never been answered is how. How do you coordinate the daily lives of 8,000 people without centralized authority? How do you maintain social order without police or military or governmental institutions? How do you resolve disputes, allocate resources, and make collective decisions when everyone appears to be equal? How do you build and maintain a city when nobody appears to be in charge? Modern urban planning assumes hierarchy. It assumes that someone gives orders and someone else follows them. It assumes that complex societies require complex institutions to hold them together. Çatalhöyük suggests the opposite, that egalitarian communities might actually be more stable than hierarchical ones, that people might be capable of organizing themselves without kings or priests or bureaucrats if they share the right values and social structures. But what those structures were, we have no idea. Then, around 5700 BCE, the settlement was abandoned, not destroyed, not conquered, abandoned. The residents packed up and left, scattering into smaller communities across the surrounding plains. They left their houses, their wall paintings, their ancestors beneath the floors. Whatever they had discovered about how to live together peacefully across 2,000 years, they took with them. And we are left staring at the ruins of something that worked better than anything we've managed to build since. A city of 8,000 people that sustained itself longer than most empires, without kings, without armies, without the violence that has characterized human settlements ever since. They knew something we don't, and they took it with them into the silence of 5,000 years on a forested hilltop in the Cianjur Regency of West Java, Indonesia, rises a stepped formation of ancient stone terraces. For centuries, local villagers have called it Gunung Padang, the mountain of light, the mountain of enlightenment. Nobody remembered who built it, nobody remembered when. It was just there, ancient, unremarkable. Another megalithic site scattered across Indonesia like dozens of others. Until 2011, when Indonesian geologist Danny Hillman Natawijaya arrived with ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography equipment, and core drilling rigs. What his team reported has generated the most explosive archaeological controversy of the 21st century. And if they're right, everything you've been taught about the origins of human civilization is wrong, not incomplete. Wrong. According to Natawijaya's findings, Gunung Padang isn't a natural hill with surface megalithic structures built on top. It's a multi-layered constructed pyramid, with the visible stone terraces representing only the uppermost and most recent phase of a structure extending dozens of meters into the hill below. Carbon dating of organic material recovered from the lower layers yielded dates that, if accepted, would place the earliest construction phases between 9,000 and 27,000 years before present. 27,000 years. The oldest reported date is approximately 25,000 BCE. That would make Gunung Padang older than the end of the last ice age. It would predate Göbekli Tepe by over 15,000 years. It would predate every known civilization by a margin so vast that accepting it would require a complete reconstruction of human prehistory. The response from the international archaeological community has been volcanic. Critics argue that the dated material may be from natural sources rather than human construction, that the subsurface features may be geological rather than architectural, that the methodology used doesn't meet the standards required for such extraordinary claims. In 2023, a study supporting the ancient dates was published in the journal Archaeological Prospection, then retracted in March 2024 following peer review concerns about the interpretation of the data. The retraction didn't disprove the findings. It concluded that the evidence was insufficient to support the claim that the lower layers represented deliberate human construction rather than natural rock formations modified by much more recent builders. But here's what makes this genuinely terrifying: the fact that the question is being asked at all. The fact that a credible team of geologists and archaeologists could examine a major Indonesian site, conduct extensive subsurface investigation, and emerge with findings suggesting the possibility of human construction predating the last ice age tells us something profound about how little we actually know about the deep past. Gunung Padang may or may not be what its investigators claim. The dates may or may not hold up under further scrutiny. The lower layers may or may not be artificial. But the simple fact that serious researchers are willing to consider the possibility of a 25-eon-year-old constructed pyramid in Southeast Asia represents a crack in the foundation of the timeline we've treated as settled science. And that crack is widening. Because if Gunung Padang is real, it means sophisticated human construction occurred during the last glacial maximum, when the world was locked in ice and populations were supposedly small, scattered, and technologically limited. It means that somewhere in the tropical latitudes, where ice sheets never reached and conditions remained survivable across the worst of the Ice Age, a civilization existed that was capable of coordinating labor, quarrying stone, and building terraced monuments tens of thousands of years before anyone is supposed to have been capable of such things. It means the entire story of how humans became civilized might be nothing more than the story of what survived into historical times after an earlier, older story ended. The truly unsettling aspect of Gunung Padang isn't whether it's 25,000 years old. It's that we have no way to be certain it's not. Across the tropical zones of Earth, across Indonesia, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, Central Africa, and the Amazon basin, vast regions of dense forest and deep soil conceal landscapes that have never been systematically surveyed. Satellite imagery and LiDAR scans conducted over the past decade have repeatedly revealed traces of previously unknown settlements, road networks, and earthworks beneath jungle canopy where archaeologists assumed nothing existed. Every year, new sites emerge that push back the timeline of human complexity in one region or another. The pattern is consistent. We are always finding more than we expected, always older than we believed possible, always in places where the accepted history said nothing should be. Gunung Padang may be a misinterpretation, or it may be the tip of an iceberg so vast that acknowledging it would require admitting that everything we've been taught about the origins of civilization is not the beginning of the story, but the final chapter of something much older that we have almost entirely lost. The hilltop in West Java sits there, silent, waiting, holding whatever secrets it holds in layers of stone and soil that may go back 25,000 years, or may not. But the uncertainty itself is what should keep you awake at night. Because if we can't be sure about Gunung Padang, what else are we wrong about? How much of human history lies buried beneath forests and seas and sediment, forgotten so completely that we don't even know to look for it? And what happened to the people who might have built it, who might have known things we're only now beginning to rediscover, who might have possessed knowledge that could change everything we think we understand about what it means to be human? The builders of Gunung Padang, if they existed, are watching us from beneath their terraces, waiting for the moment when we're finally ready to ask the questions they may have left behind for us. If we're brave enough, if we're honest enough, if we're willing to admit that the history we've been taught might be nothing more than the history of forgetting. And somewhere in that forgetting, in the silence between what we know and what we've lost, the real story of human civilization is waiting to be remembered, or discovered, or both.